Hey guys, first of all I'd like to welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar. My name is Jim Abbott. I'm with Option City Software in Chicago. With me I have Dave Brinson. He's the Director of Quantitative Analysis at Option City. What we want to do today is basically this is a representation of what Dave presented at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange about 6 weeks ago, and it was a great presentation on calendar spread options and how we're going to price these. This is actually a very timely webinar as the ICE is going to start listing calendar spread options on Monday. We have a lot of customers who are inquiring about how we're modeling these and how you do price these at the CME and various other exchanges around the world. So I think this is going to be quite informative. This is not a salesy pitch. This is more for kind of the backdrop of the modeling approach. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Dave.
Hi there. Just want to talk about the models, and we're going to basically survey what's currently known in the models, what are generally accepted, and go over the rationale and issues that we've got for pricing of calendar spread options. So, starting with the Black-Scholes and the normal models, then we'll continue by some examples of data and then talk about correlation and how that shows up in the data. And finally, two models that cover correlation, namely the Bachelier model for spreads and the Kirk model. Okay. All right. So let's take, for the entire presentation as an example, the 12-month August expiring 2012 calendar spread option. Now, going back to the 9th of April, we actually had a -6 strike option that settled at 0.875. We had an underlying for the first leg of the contract around 118. The second leg of the contract was 124, and the spread actually was negative 5.775, about 116 days to expiration. So we've got some inputs to a model that aren't necessarily what we're used to, and the big question is, well, what model do we use and what volatility do we use? One of the problems, an obvious one from the example before, is that spreads can be negative, they can be positive, they can even pass through zero. Okay? And when the prices of both legs are closely related, then the spread tends to stay within a range of values. Now, that could mean that the legs, they're going to move in tandem up and get very, let's say, high values and low values for the futures, and the spread might not move at all. So there can be some interesting sort of differences between the volatility of each of the legs versus the actual volatility of the spread, or rather just when I say vol, not having defined it yet, just the price movement in general terms. Okay, so here's the Black-Scholes formula, and I just want to point out how we have a division by the strike in the log, and we also have a log that we're taking of the strike, the spot and the strike, spot divided by strike. Two problems with this come up just from a pure numerical perspective, and that is that if the strike is 0, the thing blows up and we can't get a value. Also, if it turns out that the underlying is maybe small but positive, like 10 ticks over 0, and the strike is maybe a quarter tick under 0, you're going to get a negative number, and that also doesn't work. So, as a general rule, the Black-Scholes formula isn't really the best starting point because of these issues. Negative strikes, positive underlyings, 0 strike. We've got to do something. So let's move on. We've got another model that has also been used and is generally accepted in many markets, the Bachelier model. This is just the normal model where we have, instead of a log normal distribution or a normal distribution of percent changes, we've got an actual normal distribution of the prices themselves. Now that allows you to have negative values, positive values, you can cross through 0, and and you have no issues as far as pricing is concerned. Fairly similar in terms of how it looks to the Black-Scholes formula, but again, we don't have any of those issues that we had with the black model. All right, so having that as a starting point, I think the natural thing to do would be to look at not black or Black-Scholes vols, but normal vols. So let's look at the historical data that underlies that August-October spread. And as you can see, we've got price changes ranging from realized volatility of 5 points going all the way up to 10 or 12 points, and oscillating up and down, maybe hitting a low of around 3 in this region here. And you know, various different kinds of points to look at. So if we take normal volatility and look at, for example, a 20-day volatility window, try and just stick it in the normal model, we get a price of 1.223, and here, and a delta of negative 47. Okay? The implied vol, if I were to actually try and get that 0.875 price, is actually going to be considerably less than the almost 6 normal volatility that we used in the model. So that's an example. Let's move on. So let's look now at the actual settle prices that we used to generate the spread and that we used to look at the volatility. There's a trend in the early part of the history of upward trend in prices, and I think if you look at it, you'll see that the spread is actually looking reasonably tight. And then as we get later on in the history, the spread actually widens, and I'm referring to the gap between the two. So let's actually look now at the actual spread. Okay, of volatilities first. So let's look at the volatilities. We've got, again, ranging between high and low vols. One of the things to note here, let me jump forward so you can see where I'm getting at, is the actual spread in that tighter period that we were looking at before, where the two futures were moving pretty much in tandem. Now, bearing in mind that as you go down, it's actually getting larger negative. So the -2 is actually the smallest spread, and then down here we've got a much, much larger spread. So in the earlier region, we had a fairly tight spread, and then in the closer to expiration, the spread widened, and the volatility, let's go back to the vols of the two legs. Okay, hang on. There we are. Okay, the vols of the two legs were kind of moving up and down and kind of varying quite a bit, whereas if we actually look at the realized black vol, that later period where the spread widened, we had we had a much, much smaller vol. To some extent, that had to do with the fact that when the spread is very large, you're dividing by a larger number, and so your volatility is generally going to be smaller. So here we are, we've got volatility that kind of track, they pull apart between the two legs, and then they track again, and the actual volatility of the spread doesn't necessarily bear a relationship, at least as far as we can see, between the volatilities of the two separate legs. So that leads us to think, well, there's got to be some way that we can relate the volatilities. And that then comes to what's known as correlation. Now, in simple terms, we're basically just trying to take some numerical representation, some kind of a sample number that tells us how well the data tracks, moves together Does it move in opposite directions? And in this particular example, if you look at like all of the data that I have got that I'm looking at, we have a correlation of 0.9274. Now, what does that mean in this picture? You can kind of see that that just means that when we have higher values in one of the underlyings, then we tend to have higher change values in the same direction in the other underlying. And likewise, when the first leg has negative movement, negative price movement, then the other leg tends to have negative price movement. And as a whole, things tend to move in the same direction in roughly the same magnitude. So it generally is representative of a high correlation. Now, you can have a correlation between -1 and 1, where 1 means that pretty much everything fits exactly along this line if the data is essentially normally behaving. And a correlation of -1 would have this whole line tilt to a negative slope, where we have positive price changes in one would correspond to negative price changes in the other. All right, so let's look at the models that incorporate that, and let's go a little bit further. Okay. So first of all, once we've got this representation of price movement, we'd like to know what we're going to do with that to try and get a volatility. Basically, there's a formula that enables us to get a vol from the two legs and the volatilities of those. So the thing to kind of look at here is we're looking at the variance of one of the contracts, the variance of the other contract, and then we're subtracting out, and the subtraction actually comes from the fact that we're dealing with a spread, okay? One contract minus the other. So we're going to take 2 times the correlation times the vol of the first leg times the vol of the second leg. And when we add all that up, we get a new variance, which we can take the square root of, and get a volatility of the spread. Now, one of the things to sort of bear in mind is when contracts track together, and one of them is fairly volatile, the other one is going to be likewise volatile in very much the same direction. So if price movement is really tracking quite well, then when one contract goes up 1 point, then the other contract goes up 1 point, and the spread doesn't change. So that basically suggests that your spread volatility is going to be smaller when things are moving in tandem, and then when things move less in tandem, then the vol isn't going to collapse upon itself. One vol from one contract and the vol from the other contract will actually accumulate instead of cancel out. And that would be when you have low correlation. Okay, so here's the probably, well, this is the normal analog of taking that correlation and coming up with a price approach that's going to take the volatilities from the two contracts and actually come up with a model that we can price off of. Now, the thing that I would point to is in the original normal model equation, we had a spot, or the underlying, and then we subtracted out the strike. So this is essentially what it is, and now the underlying is the spread itself. Likewise, the strike minus the spread for the put. So this is all pretty much exactly the same formula. What is different is that the volatility is using that correlation formula, where we take a volatility from the first contract, a volatility from the second contract, and then the correlation component. Now, this is slightly different in this model because what we're actually using to come up with a normal vol is log normal volatilities. And so this is a transformation that if you were into the math, we could look up, and I have some references of papers that you could always look at and try and figure out where that comes from. But basically, it's the same formula with a new vol that's put in that involves correlation and the original vols from the two legs. let's move on to the Kirk model. This is the Black-Scholes variant that also takes the same concept. So here we have the volatility of the second leg, the volatility of the first leg, and the correlation or the cross-correlation component, and that's all added up, put in the square root, and we get a vol. And essentially, the workaround for the Black-Scholes model is to convert the spread as a strike into the second leg plus that spread strike. And then the first leg ends up being your underlying. So there's a small transformation, and that bypasses the problems that we've got with division by zero, because the underlyings and of the first leg and the second leg can't be zero in that assumption. So that way we bypass the issues. Okay, so what we've got is, with both the Bachelier model that I pointed at here and the Kirk model, we have two different ways that we can actually come up with the option prices that involve both of the legs. And one of the advantages of that is that now we actually have two underlyings involved, and we can actually get a delta for both of those underlyings, and we can get Greeks that involve the interaction with the separate legs, and sometimes that's desirable. All right, so here's an example again, and now this time we're going to use the Kirk model, and from the historical data calculated a realized volatility of roughly 14.5 for one of the legs, realized vol of 13.72 for the other leg, and then I took a 20-day window, calculated the correlation, and with the formula right here, that vol, we end up with a 5.5% Kirk vol. Now note that because the correlation was reasonably high, that our 14 vol in one leg and our 14 vol in the other leg ended up collapsing a little bit, and we ended up with only a 5 vol that we stuck into the black formula. Now, if you like, you can actually get a copy of the book that contains this model here. This is Espen Garter Haag's book, and he actually has a spreadsheet that anybody can go and buy in the book and price with that. And we just did that as far as the inputs that we just calculated. So we have our 14 vol for the first leg, our 13.7 vol for the second leg, the correlation that we put in, and we actually came up with a number that was similar to the number that we originally got when we stuck realized volatilities in to the plain old normal model without correlation. And that's kind of reassuring that we end up getting something similar. So that says there's a couple things going on here. Maybe our realized vol that we had in the past is greater than what we expect as we approach expiration. There's also other things that come into play when we're looking at correlation. And this is maybe the interesting thing that I would leave you with, is that correlation, when you're dealing with the Kirk model and the Bachelier spread model, ends up being extremely important. And that is kind of like, you can think of it as an implied volatility parameter, that if you change that correlation number in just the slightest amount, you can actually get a fairly dramatic difference in the actual value. So if I were to price using the same vols that I had before and just change the correlation from 0.932 to 0.967, we can actually match the market. Okay? So there's a couple more knobs that you want to turn when you deal with these multi-factor models with correlation and vols of both legs. But the one thing that you might find as valuable is that when you're all said and done doing this, we actually have two deltas, and it might be important that, when both of the legs move in different directions or in the same direction, you might actually want the spread to not change, and still you may actually be accumulating a little bit of delta. And so this type of model can address those issues. Okay, so these are the references that I mentioned before. There's a paper on the top that's essentially the mathematicians or the quants sort of approach. Then the book, that spreadsheet that I just showed you, the hog text that has a bunch of option formulas, and then the original Kirk model paper and the original paper that had the Bachelier spread model. So if you need, you can always try and get a copy of these papers and the text, and I guess I will open it up to questions if there are any.
Yeah, and this is Jim. If any of you want to chat a question in, we're happy to take them. Just from a trader standpoint, we're looking at this, and more traders are looking for opportunities in the options world. So more and more people are contacting Option City. They're looking more at these calendar spreads. A lot of them are kind of unsure. They seem enticing. Obviously, they see the movement in it, but they're, just by looking at the quick presentation, not being as detailed in the math as you are, my takeaway is, hey, you've got to be pretty spot on with your correlation. You see the correlation. It's certainly measurable, but the assumptiveness of some of these models, you have to know. And so they come to us, and they're, I want everybody to understand, when there's no set answer, or what would be your recommendation when they're trying to familiarize themselves before they start actively trading in large size in this?
My understanding of it from the people I've spoken with on these models is that some people find that it's good enough to price just off of the spread, and then in that case you would actually use the Bachelier model, which we put in before. Is it going to here? Right. Where you just use the Bachelier model, and you don't really care about that if the spread doesn't change and you don't accumulate deltas, for example, or maybe there's another way that as a sophisticated trader you know how to account for that outside of the model, then you might find that this is the simple approach, and you'll just worry about modeling the price distribution of the spread directly.
Right.
Okay? So that is really something that I think the specialists out there who are actually trading these products need to do on their in their decision process. What does it say? Okay. Would you like? I have a comment on leaving the slides up. If there's a particular slide that you would like to go back to, I can.
Just for reference, this is going to be published on our website probably within 48 hours, so you can access this entire recording. If you want to go back in piecemeal, we didn't mean to be too assumptive and just fly through these, or that you were going to be able to dissect the actual modeling and the formulas. If you want to do that, we're going to have the slides available. This is in response to one of our questions. And we didn't mean to do that, and we should have clarified that at the start.
Yeah, one of the things to kind of take away from this is I don't expect that any of you are going to be able to look at like the Bachelier model that we've got up on the screen and be able to incorporate, oh, I see exactly what's going on there. Or for that matter, going back and looking at the Black-Scholes model. Okay, here. The main point of even showing you this is just simply the fact that we're dividing by a strike, and that when you take the log, you can't have a negative number and you can't have an infinite number. So apart from that, really the takeaway is just this is a rough sort of idea as to the concepts behind the models. So again, if you want to, you can always take a look at the slides and you can stare at them for as long as you like later. And also, for that matter, we're available if you have questions about specifics on any of them.
Yeah, and it's more and more people are coming into the calendar spread options. We are, you know, Dave and I both field questions. I'll field them, and a lot of times I go to Dave as a reference, and sometimes we include him, especially with the clients. I think that is a great point about the takeaway. You know, the Black-Scholes and other models oftentimes don't account for the negative or the zero value. So if nothing else, there's your takeaway. Not to get too pitchy for Option City, but we will, within our suite of options pricing models, we do have in our model, if you are Option City customers, this would be the normal.
We have the normal
low boundary
yeah.
modeling is most similar to the Bachelier's, if he's pronounced.
And for that matter, if you actually have your own pricing system in the background, one of the things that's useful to know is that you can actually price using the Kirk model, and you can price using the Bachelier spread model by simply calculating the volatilities as inputs and pumping them through Subway to our system.
Within the Subway being our API, if you're not familiar with that.
And that's as a stopgap as we work on a full solution where we'd actually do that for you.
For other people that are considering trading in calendar spread options, oftentimes the next one is how do you, when you're starting, then you're talking about the curvature and how you're matching it. There are a couple of different ways, and I'm not going to get too far into this because this is open for debate and open for refinement. We do also, in our software, we do allow you to pump in the settlement values, and a lot of people run them off of that. I think that's probably a good primer for you to start with, looking at it, and then you can kind of go from there, and we can certainly offer suggestions. Obviously, we don't teach people or tell them how to trade. We are a tool to trade, but we try to provide you with a proper toolbox for that. If there are no other questions, I hope you if you're more interested in the modeling, you'll revisit this on our website. Certainly, we welcome anyone to call us, and we can talk at length in more detail to your particular trading strategies or needs. Again, my name is Jim Abbott. On the video here, you see my email. Please feel free to contact me or just contact Option City in general. You can use me as a first point of reference, and I can certainly bring Dave into the conversation as needed. With that, we certainly appreciate you taking time out of the busy day after your close today, and we look forward to talking to you all again soon. Thanks so much for joining us.